Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 45.
Passion, dedication, and inspiration. If you're ready to hear inspiring interviews with amazing trauma therapists, this is it. Right here, right now. With your host, Guy McPherson.
Welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson, and this is the podcast where we're interviewing master trauma therapists, really from all over the world, really to learn about what they're doing, what's driving them, and the steps they've taken to become masters in their field. If you're a trauma therapist, if you're interested in trauma therapy, or if you're just passionate about helping other people, this is it. Today, I'm so excited to introduce my guest, Dr. Ghislaine Boulanger. Ghislaine, are you ready to go?
I am, Guy, yes.
All right. Ghislaine Boulanger is a psychologist and psychoanalyst in private practice in New York City and a member of the Relational faculty at New York University's Postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. Since the publication of her book, Wounded by Reality, Understanding and Treating Adult Onset Trauma, she has taught and published extensively on the psychodynamic dilemmas facing adults who have survived violent and life-threatening events. All right, Ghislaine, just a little bit about you and your background I've given. Take a moment, share with us something personal, where you're calling from, and if you're calling from New York, how the snowstorm's getting to you or not. But go ahead.
Well, we're not that far north. I'm in New York City, and while it is unpleasantly cold and very unwelcomely cold, I'm in my office on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and I have my Skype open on my desk, so I'm looking at your face here, Guy. Although I know we're not doing a visual.
Right. And so how long have you been in New York?
I hate to say this, 50 years.
Wow. Okay. And you're originally from?
I was raised in England, but my father was French.
Okay, nice.
So that was a little unusual for the years when I was growing up in England. Okay. Now England is very heterogeneous.
So, Ghislaine, as you know, this podcast really is about getting to know you, finding out your influences and experiences along the way. The way we start here is with a quote, something that's inspired you. Share with us something that's kind of guided you along your journey.
I'm going to read something, Guy, because actually you gave me an opportunity to go back to the passage that I was literally walking through the airport in Atlanta. In fact, going to International Trauma, I don't think it was the International at that point, the Trauma Society Studies, whatever it is, group. And I came across this passage in a book called The Interpersonal World of the Infant. I'm sure many of your listeners know it, by Daniel Stern. And when I read this, I said, oh my God, this is exactly what happens to, at that point, I was mainly working with Vietnam vets. And I thought, I really have to find a way of understanding how this happens to them. So let me read you what Dan Stern says. He says, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, that he's talking about the sense of the self and the necessity for each of the senses of the self to be online, to be up and functioning. And he says, without the sense of agency, there is paralysis, the sense of non-ownership of self-action, the experience of loss of control to external agents. Without the sense of physical cohesion, there can be fragmentation of bodily experience, depersonalization, out-of-body experiences, and derealization. Without the sense of continuity, there is temporal dissociation, fugue states, amnesia, and, to quote Winnicott, not going on being. Without the sense of affectivity, there is anhedonia, dissociated states, and I would add numbness to that. And then without these, it is very difficult to achieve a subjective self, the sense of a subjective self. And without that, there is a sense of tremendous isolation and not being able to communicate with other people, which leads to a loss of meaning. So I've given you a very long paraphrase of this.
Yeah, but go ahead.
But I mean, as I say, it just stunned me. I was really excited when I read it. And I remember, this must have been about 1983 or 84, these meetings. And I remember buttonholing one of my friends, Tom Williams, who was an ex-Marine and a psychologist, and saying, you have to listen to this because this explains what goes on. This explains why what I now call adult onset trauma lasts so long, why it feels like a collapse of the self. I have no idea what he said to me. I think he thought I was overexcited. But that sort of fueled my work, actually, for the next 20 years.
Wow. Well, I think that's a pretty amazing quote, and I think it really wonderfully, as you said, describes what happens from the neurobiology and how that sets everything offline, and then the subsequent kind of cascade of dissociation, depersonalization, derealization. Why did that at that time have such resonance for you? It almost begs the question, what was going on prior to this, that kind of prepared you or set you up in a sense for being so moved by this quote, by this passage?
Yeah, exactly. When I was looking for a dissertation topic in the late 70s, I was in the clinical psychology program at Columbia University. And a professor who was actually not in clinical psych, but in the social psych program, said to me, do you want to join a group of researchers, all social scientists, no other psychologists, with whom I'm working, looking at Vietnam vets and trying to understand what the hell happened to them. I think at this point, I should tell you, in the 70s, it was as if we were reinventing the wheel. After the First World War, after the Second World War, in some ways, Korean veterans totally disappeared. But it was like we couldn't hold on to the idea of how long the reactions lasted. And here, there were a group of Vietnam vets meeting, in fact, with a guy called Hai Shatton and with Bob, doesn't matter, I'll come back to his name in a moment. They formed the first kind of group for vets to talk to one another outside of the mental health professionals, because mental health professionals, and particularly the VA, simply were not listening to what they were saying. I mean, I remember a paper from that time saying, sorry, my earphone fell out, saying, we have to think about whether this is schizophrenia, and this is how we would differentiate it from schizophrenia. So these guys found in this rap group some people who would really listen to them. And the folks who would listen to them came to this professor at Columbia University, Charles Kadushin, and said, would you like to start an epidemiological study of this group? And we started, I think, with, I don't remember how many we started with, but we ended up with 1,300 people, which was actually a very, very big group at that point. It was nationwide, it was in rural areas, it was in suburban areas, it was in urban areas. And we were looking at the adjustment of Vietnam vets on a number of different levels, mainly psychosocial. But I was interested in what we called at that time long-term stress reactions, because I'm sure everybody in your audience knows that in 78, there was no such thing as PTSD. We had a number of diagnoses open to us, but there really was no such thing as PTSD. So we called them long-term stress reactions. And I found with my work that if I controlled for combat and for the amount of combat that vets had seen, even if I also controlled for predisposition, in other words, levels of mental health prior to entering the military, those men who had been in very high combat developed these long-term stress reactions. I should say, 30 to 40% of them. At lower levels, there was an interaction between the predisposition and the level of combat, the lower levels of combat. There was an interaction with predisposition. This absolutely rocked my world, because I was being trained in what was then a very psychoanalytic program that told us that if something happened to you in adult life, as long as you, if I can put it this way, had your shit together in the first place, you were going to be able to withstand it. But we knew from these vets, and we also knew from World War II vets, that these reactions, which were very similar across personality types, could last for 30, 40 years. They became chronic. And I said, well, my goodness, psychoanalysis clearly is not reaching these guys. I should just say parenthetically that the Germans, when they were asked for reparations for the Holocaust survivors, used this argument too, from DSM-2, from the ways of talking about long-term stress reactions in DSM-2. There was no such thing. They said if people haven't recovered within a few months of the stressor, then you have to look for another diagnosis, a pre-existing diagnosis. So I guess I've always been somewhat iconoclastic, and I was just stunned because I said we have to find a way of explaining this to psychodynamic therapists, to psychoanalysts, to the people in my graduate program, so that they don't keep dismissing these vets who are continuing to experience these symptoms and say, oh, it was a personality disorder. So
yeah, I mean, that's just really fascinating. And you can hear your passion, you know, about this and how this has kind of generated the work you do. And what a finding, what a discovery, really. Because as you can see, and as we know, much of the quote unquote, in a sense, blame was put on, you know, the person for not having their shit together, such that they maybe experienced this or allow this, stress to prolong for 30 or 40 years. But now here we have this finding that you're talking about, and it really does a lot of the explaining about what's going on here. So let's kind of move on, Ghislaine. And I think, you know, you've kind of set the frame really well about really what got you into the specialization. But again, this is about, you know, highlighting your journey. People get into this field for a number of reasons. You know, for me, in part, you know, my brother was in the special forces, and he came back from Iraq with PTSD. And when he came back, I was so psyched to find out what he had done and learn about his experiences. And I nagged him and pressured him. And of course, you know, it was everything that I shouldn't have done, I did. That was several years ago. And in part, you know, I want to come back and really make a difference. But share with us, you know, what got you going into this field? Why this specialization?
Why agree when this professor offered me, Charles Kadushin offered me a number of projects that he was working on at the time. Why did I jump on the Vietnam one? Is what you're asking, I think.
Yeah. What about trauma?
Oh, okay, all right. Firstly, just to say something about the Vietnam one, because I think superficially, rather than unconsciously, I was, I lived through the 60s here. I had protested the war. I had, in fact, a number of vets, for a number of reasons, come through my home and started to say, oh my God, we're not paying enough attention to these guys in and of themselves. The protest is too much. So what was it that perhaps more unconsciously drew me to trauma? As you gather, since I've been here for so long, I always hate to admit it, but I was born during World War II in England, and my family lived in London. And we actually didn't live in London, we lived just outside. But occasionally the air raids would come over us. And one of my first memories, possibly my first memory, was of my parents taking me into the air raid shelter that we actually had under our dining room table. It was a sort of metal box with a wire front. So I guess if the house was going to collapse, the table would prevent it from collapsing on us, but also this metal box would. And at that point, my brother hadn't been born, and the three of us got into this metal box, and my mother brought in some cherries. And my father then decided to distract me by encouraging me to spit cherry pits, or as they call them in England, cherry stones, out of the air raid shelter. I find this hard to believe. I'm wondering what my memory is doing with this, because my mother was quite fussy. But anyway, this is what I remember. And it was a sense of such security. It was really something. I later, when I was in boarding school, was actually near an American airbase. And when the airplanes used to go over our heads, terribly, terribly loud, I again experienced this sense of security, which was obviously taking me straight back to those auditory memories as a child when the planes were going over. It's a little perverse, paradoxical to say the least. But my parents clearly did a good job of giving me a sense of security there. So I think that I have not run away from those kinds of topics that draw people. And at the same time, obviously, there is that sort of prurient curiosity about trauma. At the same time, and on the other hand, I have an uncle who was in World War II, who came back with PTSD and was never the same again. I mean, at one point, 10 years after he got out of the military, he was marching down Wimbledon High Street with his umbrella over his shoulder, imagining somehow that he was getting ready to be sent over to France. So, this was very powerful influence. So I think that both the feeling of not being frightened off by trauma, on the one hand, and yet being so disturbed by this lovely uncle and what had happened to him, I think brought me into this field.
Yeah, I just like the almost juxtaposition of those two different things. On the one hand, that image of you sitting, crouching, I don't know what it was, down in this, this air raid shelter, spitting cherry stones, and the sounds, the image of the sounds of the planes coming over, and how that developed this sense of security, how maybe your parents even shared in that developing of that sense of security for you, and how that has since compelled you, moved you forward into this field is fascinating. I think for our listeners, people get into this field again, as I said before, for innumerable reasons, and obviously it's on a continuum in a sense. Some people have obviously experienced trauma, others have not, but whatever it is, it's just really fascinating to hear. So thank you for sharing that. So we talked a little bit about what's driven you here. You shared with us that beautiful piece by Daniel Stern, and what I want to kind of focus on now, Ghislaine, is an early clinical kind of error, something that occurred when you were just starting out, or a little bit thereafter. What happened, and really how it's influenced the work you do since.
Well, in some ways, Guy, this wasn't so early, and it's interesting that I'm talking a lot about vets because, of course, vets started my work, and of course, you have that story of your brother. And if I could just say parenthetically about the how badly you feel about having pestered your brother for information. In fact, the fact that you showed interest, maybe you pushed him a bit too much, but at least he didn't feel that kind of nobody wants to touch me, I'm radioactive, that so many vets feel when they come back.
Yeah, thank you for that.
So I'm going to actually talk about a vet who was radioactive. And he came when I was in private practice. It wasn't so early. But he worked for the government and went about that job in a kind of plodding way. He was quite paranoid. He didn't have many friends. He had terrible fights with his ex-wife, who was not letting him see his child, and at one point accused him of molesting the child, which I do not believe he had done, and I helped him with that in a lawsuit. But there were points at which he would talk about what happened in Vietnam, when he would start giggling. The kind of deference that he showed me, and I don't particularly like deference from my patients, but it kind of fitted in with this guy's general personality. The kind of deference that he showed me, just he shed it, he was arrogant, and basically he was using neologisms, the sort of made-up words. And I would think, what in God's name is happening here? I can't follow what he's saying. He's psychotic at this moment. And I would start to, at first, I didn't even think about it from session to session. I just blanked it out. And then I realized that on the days that he was coming, I would be very jumpy. And I thought, oh, God, I have to deal with this guy again. What is going on with this? He keeps returning to this place. What is going on with it? And I started to dream about bodies, about fire, about babies being killed. When I say fire, I mean sort of, villages being set on fire. I think it wasn't that explicit in my dreams. And I realized that what I was being told through my unconscious was that this man had, in fact, committed, with a number of other people, a My Lai type atrocity. And I think for maybe as much as 6 months, I had simply not been able to hear him. I had cut him off. I had sort of, I'm sure I got kind of proper or something. I just wasn't open to what he was going to say to me. And then when I was open to it, I thought, oh my God, I have to listen to this. I have to take this poisonous material inside of me. I mean, I believe that it is very important that there is something that happens between the mind of the clinician, and I should say the heart of the clinician, and the mind of the patient, and that we can strengthen by taking in not just the words, but the whole affect, everything that surrounds what the patient is telling us. We can take it in and start to make sense of it. This is really, I'm paraphrasing what Wilfred Bion would say. And I thought to myself, I don't think I thought this consciously, but I was acting as if, my God, I am not going to take that material inside of me. It will pollute me. It is terrible. How do I get rid of this guy? And it took me, so I said, it took me about 6 months to really pull myself together and start to say, I've called him David in some writing that I've done about this. David, I think you're trying to tell me something that I've not been listening to. And I'm sorry that I haven't been listening. I'm going to try and hear you now. So let's go here together. But it was a horrible, horrible failure. I'm sure I've done it to other people too without being aware of it. This kind of vicarious traumatization is horrifying, even if you come into it with a little of the imagined resilience that I have. So that would be my error.
Wow, Ghislaine, I want to thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, that is just so, I think just something so intimate about that, sharing that experience and how vulnerable, in a sense, we as clinicians sometimes have to be, need to be, don't want to be, but the kind of description you created of the heart, what needs to happen between the heart of the clinician and the mind of the client, in a sense, and how that needs to be open, and for 6 months or maybe longer, what this struggle seemed to be going on, this fight not to let in what needed to be let in. And what was it about this situation was it that you didn't have the experience, or was it in a particular time for you that you just could not stand or could not allow and sit with what this person was talking about?
I think it's the latter,
yeah.
Guy. I mean, I actually in my spare time do a fair amount of human rights activism, and so and I've been very involved, if I can just put in this plug, against the American Psychological Association and the collaboration with what's going on in Guantanamo Bay and what has gone on for so many years. So I'm very, I know a great deal, more than I really want to know, but inevitably have to know about torture, about suffering, as any of us do who do this kind of work. But to know about it from the point of view of the perpetrator, rather than the person who's perpetrated against, that was the first time I let myself know that I was hearing that material. Had I heard it before? Quite possibly. But it's to imagine the horror in that village, to imagine the excitement, and to credit that excitement that these young kids, I think this guy was in the army, that these young army kids felt as they went through this village, the omnipotence that they felt at that moment. To be able to go there was hard.
Yeah, I mean, I just really appreciate what you just said about the human rights activism that you're doing, and that it was at that point when you were sitting with that gentleman that you recognized or allowed yourself to realize that this is what was happening, and you, for the first time in a sense, heard that. And I'm curious about, and maybe we'll get to this later, but how you take care of yourself. What things do you do to buffer against that, vicarious traumatization and so forth?
It's a very, very good question. I have two answers to that. One is that I'm tremendously fortunate to have a lot of colleagues who share my interests. And there's always someone to talk to. After 9/11, I went and debriefed a lot of the, so many of us did who were in New York, went and debriefed various organizations, whatever they're called, companies that are down by the World Trade Center. And I remember one guy saying to me, I feel so, he'd actually been close enough to see people jumping out of the windows, and I think he'd known some of those people. He wasn't obviously in the World Trade Center, he was across from it. And he said, I feel so guilty to go to the gym now. I just, whenever I go, I imagine that those guys will never go to the gym again. And I talked to him very firmly about the importance of taking care of himself. I was talking to this whole group, this whole board, about the necessity of going to the gym, of eating, not drinking too much. I also worked in New Orleans 3 years after Hurricane Katrina. I was invited to go down there by the Psychoanalytic Institute there. And it was a wonderful experience because I worked only with the mental health professionals there. And I heard how they had taken care of themselves. And I will tell you, one of them talked about cooking a lot, and another one talked about gardening. I think many of them had had a hard time allowing themselves to do these things that felt so nurturing at first. But I'm telling you about the things that I also do. I mean, I do cook, I do garden, not in New York, although I do a bit in New York. Mm-hmm. But it's having colleagues is so important, and being able to talk to them. And of course, I also write, so that if I can write about these experiences, even while it's rather solitary, and I think one should broaden the intersubjective field post-trauma, I think writing very much helps me sort out my ideas. So that's one way of how do I take care of myself. The other way is that I actually believe that vicarious traumatization is a way of telling us that we are on track with a patient. And so if we keep working with the patient and we resolve our own vicarious traumatization, we are also helping the patient come to terms with, I would never say resolve, I would never say cure, but come to terms with the experiences that they have had. So vicarious traumatization is like a signal that says, oh, hang in there. You've got to work on this in more depth with your patient because you are both scared at this point.
Awesome. Okay. I love that. I love that kind of duality in the sense of self-care. Ghislaine, we get to one of my favorite questions right now. And, we talked about some of the challenges, some of the mistakes, if you will.
I'm sorry, I'm going to cough, Guy. Can you?
Okay, yeah.
I don't know if there's a way of stopping you from hearing this.
That's okay. We allow coughing on this podcast.
Water went down the wrong way. Okay, here I am. I'm back. Yeah.
But so I really feel it's important to know, what drives us day to day in this field. I mean, you shared a lot of your passion, your inspiration, and also some of the challenges too. But share with us, Ghislaine, what's your why in a sense? Why do you keep doing this day in and day out?
Let me be clear. Clinically, I don't do it day in and day out. I have a pretty regular general practice, psychotherapy, psychoanalytic practice. And I think it's terribly important for people not just to see trauma cases. I remember saying this when I was in New Orleans during the first talk that I gave down there. And of course, I felt like a total fool because everybody in New Orleans had this dreadful experience with Katrina. And of course, they had no choice. But so I think if I did it every day, I would be burned out. I don't. Even with the gardening, the cooking, the friends, etc., I would. If I did it every day, it would be too much. I would be very raw. But there's a couple of things. I've been stunned by the way in which my book has generated interest. And so that's very, very gratifying to me, of course, but it also makes me want to think more about this topic. When I first, just to go back to the whole question of psychoanalysis and its recalcitrance in this area, as you read, I'm a relational analyst, and relational analysts are not particularly, in fact, many of them not at all Freudian, not at all classical. Nonetheless, I was told not to write this book. I was told everybody knows everything they need to know about trauma. So there is a kind of sweet revenge in finding that actually a lot of people are very curious about adult onset trauma and feel helped by being understood. So that keeps me going, and other professionals, this sounds very self-involved, but other professionals' interest in what I have to teach is very important to me. And then the opportunity to sort of build on my knowledge by talking with other people who share these interests. Mm-hmm. So it's intellectual, but I don't think at the level at which and I suspect you too, live and work, you can really separate out intellectual and affect. Mm-hmm. The passion sort of puts them together.
So just kind of continuing on with this thread here, to that end, what advice or suggestions would you have for people who want to begin, getting into this field of trauma or learning about trauma-informed treatment? Yeah.
Okay, the first thing I would do is that if you are interested in becoming a psychotherapist, whether it's as a psychologist, a social worker, a counselor, any of these things, please get a good all-round general training. The idea of going into to qualify or to become a trauma therapist, which is an expression I really dislike, before you have an all-around basis foundation is a very bad idea because you really don't know about working under better conditions, and you need to know that. I would say get a lot of supervision when you start to work when you find yourself with a patient who's been traumatized. get a lot of supervision. Certainly at that point, perhaps classes that present you with the whole range of what people consider traumatic today is a good idea. I, as I said to you, Guy, I think before we started, really feel that the term trauma is terribly overused. And when I talk about trauma for an adult, and I'm talking about adult onset trauma so that it's something that happens in adulthood, I am talking about an experience that where you think that you are about to die, or you see other people who've been badly wounded, or someone very close to you has died or had a terrible experience, so that you are exposed to these extremes of human experience. That's what I consider trauma in adulthood. And that is important to learn about that, independently of learning about what people talk about as trauma in childhood. And that can very often be betrayal trauma and seduction, incest, of course, separations. Those are terrible things. I'm not making value judgments here, but I'm saying that they're very different. And I think it's important to have a sense of what is included and what is traumatic for children, what is shocking for children, and what is shocking for adults. And it's important to get exposed to ideas that deal with both those things.
Okay, great. So you're talking about, the first thing you said was really make sure you get a really strong general education.
Yeah.
Get that foundation. Supervision obviously comes up, get a lot of supervision. And, I think it's really important to hear what you're saying for our listeners too, which is you're really drawing out the distinction and making that clear between, adult onset trauma and, traumas that happen to kids or betrayal traumas, attachment traumas, et cetera, understanding that difference, understanding what's involved with, working with individuals who've been exposed to either or both in that sense. And
as you say, so often, and just to say, so often, unfortunately, it is both.
Yeah.
But it's a good idea to understand the consequences of each.
So your book, can you just talk a little bit about your book? And because it sounds like that was really something you almost needed to write in a sense. I'm getting that feeling from you.
Oh, I think unquestionably I needed to write it. I had a box sort of that had held bottles of wine or something under my desk for several years when I was in analytic training, and I would just throw into this box any thoughts I had, any quotes I had. I remember I had a patient who was, among other things, an alcoholic, and she used to keep looking at this box, this empty liquor box. It was quite funny. But that gave me an opportunity then to sort of sort out all these random thoughts and using that quote of Daniel Stern's that I gave you to try to start to make sense of what I consider to be adult onset trauma, both to define it, as I have defined it to you, but in a bit more long-winded than that. It's taken me a chapter to do that. Maybe I'll say something about separating it from, or how I distinguish it in my mind from PTSD, but we can do that in a moment. I then wanted to write about the phenomenology of these symptoms. You were so right in summarizing what I said about Daniel Stern by talking about the neurobiology of stress. But in fact, of course, phenomenologically, we experience that neurobiology in a particular way. And I wanted to talk about it in the moment of trauma, and then how that lasts and lasts and lasts, how it kind of, it gets into a kind of feedback loop. So for instance, if you feel, and just to give you one thing, where you feel you have no agency, right? You're in, actually sometimes soldiers will say, I was on automatic pilot, but it's still not them that are doing it. Or a woman who's raped saying, I couldn't do it, I had to do what he said. I had no agency. And those are not the words she would use, but that would be the feeling. And then afterwards, you know, of course you know, the intrusive thoughts, memories that we have of a traumatic experience. Again, we feel as if we have no agency. We have no control over those. It feels as if it's happening from the outside. So how the trauma continues to be experienced through post-traumatic life is important. Then I talk about how, because of the loss so often of the intersubjective, the ability to feel that there's, I'm going to quote someone here whom I very much admire, which is Dori Laub. Dori Laub is a psychoanalyst at Yale who co-ran the Holocaust archives at Yale. He was a child survivor, and he writes most beautifully about adult onset trauma. And Dori talks about the loss of the internal empathic other during massive psychic trauma. If you lose that, if you start to unravel and you lose the sense of internal voices in your head, good voices in your head, you lose the belief that you can talk to someone who will listen to you. You lose the belief that you will have a witness. And so that has a lot of meaning for how you go into therapy, whether you go into therapy, how the therapist works with you under those circumstances. And then once you may have established yourself as an empathic other to the patient, there's a whole question of what kind of work can you actually do? How do you hear the patient's narrative? Sometimes it's very, very concrete. How do you tolerate that concrete narrative? How do you resist the temptation that people sometimes have to make links with earlier experiences? Maybe the link is there, but right now you have to pay attention to what the patient is telling you about their real life experience during the trauma. So I think that, and then the other part of the book that I talk about all the ways in which this is such difficult work, just the kinds of things I was saying about vicarious traumatization, but all the ways in which we avoid doing this because it is such difficult work.
And the name of the book again is Wounded by Reality, Understanding and Treating Adult Onset Trauma, and that will be available as a link on the show notes page at westcoasttraumaproject.com. Ghislaine, that was I just love the way you're speaking about the importance of understanding the phenomenological experience and how we as clinicians, need to be that empathic other, and how that's going to inform the work we do. So just phenomenal stuff for our listeners. What two books, trauma related or not, would you share with us that have really kind of influenced you either personally or professionally or both?
It's difficult to say books because I tend to read articles more than books. So if I could just say authors for a moment, I would really recommend, and if you need me, Guy, to give you some actual articles, I will be happy to give them to you.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great. We can link them up.
But I really recommend anything by Dori Laub. Laub tends to write, I guess because English was not his first language, tends to write with other authors. But his grasp of adult onset trauma and also of childhood trauma is very much along. He speaks in very much the kind of language that I'm speaking in.
And that's Dorilaub.
Right, two words.
Okay.
And I can send you a representative selection of Dori's articles that have been helpful to me. Gosh, there are so many articles that are important. I'm sorry I didn't think about...
Well, I mean, we don't need the name of articles right now, but I think the name is sufficient at this point.
I'm going to send you one other, actually. I'm going to send you a reference for another, which was written recently, or in the last 5 years, by some folks in Texas, talking about the feeling of being an exile as a survivor. Not just vets, but as a survivor generally. The feeling of being an exile. It's something that I write about a lot. And it's a wonderful article, and I will definitely send you that reference too.
Okay. So those are two there. Again, they'll be linked up in the show notes page. Ghislaine, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this. You are a force. I mean, your passion in this field and for the work you do is palpable. And I'm not the only one I know who can sense it and experience it. So I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Thank you, Guy. It was a great interview. It was lovely to be able to talk about this.
Okay. Well, take care, and we will speak soon.
Sure.
All right, folks, I want to say thank you so much for listening to the podcast. What I want to do right now is invite you to contact me at guy@westcoasttraumaproject.com. I'd love to hear from you. I want to invite you to share two things with me. One, why are you doing this? Why are you in this field? And that's my favorite question I ask every master trauma therapist on the podcast. Number two, what are you struggling with? What are your sticky points? I have so many myself, but I'd love to hear from you. Guy@westcoasttraumaproject.com. Thanks so much.